Today, we're diving into the story of a leader who was a total paradox of strength and humility. A ruler whose immense power wasn't driven by his own ambition, but by what he believed was a divine blueprint for justice and compassion. And his story starts not with a show of force, but with a confession of his own weakness. So, when Umar ibn al-Khattab became the second caliph, you'd think there'd be celebrations, right? Nope. People were actually scared of him. He had this reputation for being incredibly severe, and honestly, they were worried about what his rule would mean for them. But here's the thing, Omar knew this about himself, and his very first act as leader wasn't some grand decree. It was a deeply personal prayer. He stood up in front of everyone, admitted his own harshness, and asked God to fundamentally change him. He understood that the man he wasn't the leader his people needed him to be. And that, right there, is the heart of his story. His biggest challenge wasn't conquering new lands or enemies, it was conquering himself. It was this journey of profound personal transformation to meet the incredible demands of his new role. For Umar, real leadership started with knowing yourself, flaws and all. So where did this idea of leadership even come from? It wasn't some political playbook he cooked up. For Umar, the instructions were crystal clear, and he believed they came directly from a divine source. This was the blueprint he was absolutely determined to follow. The first pillar of that blueprint was a direct command from the Quran, and the message was unambiguous. Leadership demands gentleness. A harsh heart, the scripture warns, will just push people away. So when Omar prayed to be made softer, he was directly responding to this divine instruction. The second pillar was just as important. Shoora, which means mutual consultation. And get this, look at where this verse places consultation. It's listed right next to establishing prayer. That elevates it from just a good idea to a sacred duty. A leader isn't supposed to be a dictator. They are commanded to seek out advice. Okay, so Umar didn't just keep these principles to himself. In his very first public speech, he translated this divine blueprint into a kind of social contract, a set of promises that would come to define his entire rule. And here you can see the core of his promise. He was basically telling people, look, my harshness isn't gone, it's just been repurposed. For anyone who is an oppressor, he would be an unyielding force of justice. But for the humble and the God-fearing, he promised the exact opposite, a deep, personal humility. He would, in his own words, lay his own cheek on the ground for them. His promises didn't stop there. They went straight to economic integrity. When it came to the public treasury, the Bayt al-Mal, he gave this incredible analogy. He said his relationship to it was like a guardian's to an orphan's wealth. If he had his own money, he'd take nothing. If he was in need, he would only take what was absolutely reasonable. I mean, that sets an unbelievable standard for public trust. And these promises aren't just legends. They're written down in historical accounts. He promised to tax fairly, to spend public money correctly, to increase people's stipends, and even to personally make sure the families of soldiers were cared for while they were away. He was basically saying, here are my promises, now hold me to them. So, he made the promise of consultation, of shoora. But what did that actually look like in practice? For him, this wasn't just some abstract theory, it was the day-to-day mechanics of how he ran things. Well, his circle of advisors was, let's just say it was incredibly inclusive for the time. Of course, he talked to the wise elder companions of the prophet, but he also deliberately sought out young people because he valued, as he put it, the sharpness of their minds. He consulted military experts, and historical sources even say he would consult with women and take their opinion if he believed it was sound. And crucially, this wasn't just for show. It wasn't political theater. The sources are really clear on this. If anyone, no matter their status, could prove his view was wrong with actual evidence, Umar would back down. His loyalty was to the truth, not to his own ego. Now, it's one thing to have principles when everything's calm, right? But the true test of a leader always comes during a crisis. And a terrible plague in Syria provided exactly that kind of test, pitting political pressure against prophetic guidance. So picture this. Umar is leading his army towards Syria, and suddenly they get news of this devastating plague. His commanders were split. Some wanted to push forward, others said to turn back immediately. And right in the middle of this confusion, one of the companions remembered this very specific instruction from the Prophet Muhammad. It was, for all intents and purposes, a clear quarantine protocol. The second Omar heard that, the debate was over. He immediately ordered the army to turn around. Someone actually asked him if he was fleeing from God's decree, and his reply was so profound. He said he was moving from one of God's decrees to another. His actions showed his core belief. A leader's true wisdom is found in sticking to divine guidance. So all of this humility, this consultation, this absolute devotion to Scripture, it all points to one central concept that really defined Umar's entire philosophy. It was the crucial difference between it being a caliph and being a king. I mean, just listen to his own words. They reveal this deep, genuine anxiety he had. For him, the idea of becoming a king was genuinely terrifying. And when he asked someone to explain the difference, the answer he got became his life's mission. And here's that difference. A caliph, in his view, was a guardian, someone bound by divine law, totally accountable for public funds. A king, on the other hand, ruled by his own whim, powerful enough to take from one person just to give it to another. Umar spent his entire rule trying to be that guardian, and never, ever a king. He once used this amazing metaphor to describe his job. He said the people were like a noble camel, willing to follow, but also proud, and you couldn't abuse it. So all the responsibility fell on the driver, the leader, to guide them with care and never lead them into harm's way. And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? Umar saw his job not as a perk or a privilege, but as a heavy, difficult trial that he would be judged for. So it makes you wonder, how would our world change today if every single person in power saw their authority not as a personal right, but as a sacred trust for which they would one day have to answer?